The world's largest security body, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, met in Vienna today with the goal of trying to push Russia, the US, and its European allies towards dialogue, with the goal of diffusing mounting tensions on the border between Russia and Ukraine. The West accuses Moscow of massing tanks, artillery, and about 100,000 soldiers on Ukraine's eastern border in recent weeks. Well, NATO says this is preparation for an invasion, but Moscow insists it's a response to what it sees as the growing presence of NATO in its sphere of influence. Well, for more, I'm joined by international affairs commentator Doug Herbert. Doug, these talks ended with both sides seemingly as far apart as ever.
And we should hardly be shocked. This was really preordained, given that both sides were coming into these talks with views that are just about as polar opposite as you can get when it comes to notions of Europe's security architecture. A short while ago, the United States ambassador to the OSCE, which is that broad security forum, 57 members, which met today in Vienna, he basically briefed reporters, and what did he say? He said, essentially at the end of the talks, the outcome is, we've been clear, we being the Western Europe, the US, their allies, we're not going to renegotiate core principles which have been at the heart of post-World War II European security architecture. What are those things? The notion that independent sovereign nations should have the right to choose their own allies, to choose their own alliances, to choose their own direction and foreign policy, and that another country should not be able to dictate to anyone else based on that country's notion, i.e. Russia's notion of spheres of influence. As Michael Carpenter, the U.S. ambassador, put it, he says, we're not going to entertain notions of spheres of influence. It's a non-starter. And that's really where it's also a game over as far as these talks go, because once you have a position in which one side says we are not entertaining notions of spheres of influence, that is this notion that even though the Soviet Union collapsed 30 years ago, Russia still sees the former Soviet states, at least the vast majority of them, as being part of its own backyard, and therefore that it has the prerogative to enforce its own sort of laws, if you will, even though they are sovereign nations, in this area, and not let Westerners encroach on these areas. Where do we go from here? And this is where it gets difficult. Right now, basically, they say the U.S. is saying, if the Russians walk away from these talks going forward, it will show that they were never really keen on a real diplomatic dialogue to begin with. The Russians, meanwhile, are saying just the opposite. They're saying, you know what, if these talks collapse, if everything collapses and the West keeps up the military pressure, we might actually, a senior Russian official said this earlier today, Russia might deploy troops to Cuba and Venezuela. Deploying troops to Cuba, I mean, that is reminiscent of the 1960s Bay of Pigs crisis. It's opening up a whole Back to the Future Cold War era chapter of history again. You can get a sense how far these sides apart. They are both convinced that they have the sort of stranglehold on the truth here, and at least they're talking, but it's not looking pretty good coming out of these talks after a week of diplomatic rounds of discussions.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, our international affairs commentator Doug Herbert.